The mayor of Santo André, Celso Daniel from the Workers' Party, PT, was kidnapped last night in the southern zone of São Paulo. Throughout the entire night, politicians from the Workers' Party held a vigil here in front of the city council, waiting for information and possible contact from the kidnappers.
On the night of January 18, 2002, a Friday, the mayor of Santo André, Celso Daniel, had dinner at the Rubaia restaurant in the Jardins neighborhood of São Paulo. On the other side of the table was his longtime friend, businessman Sergio Gomes da Silva, known among his closest friends as Sombra. Celso Daniel was an engineer, a former federal deputy, one of the founders of the Workers' Party, and he was being considered to coordinate the government plan and to be Lula's Minister of Finance, as Lula would run for president again that year. He was the strongest guy in the party in the ABC region of São Paulo. He had been elected mayor of Santo André 3 times, the last time with more than 70% of the votes. After 2 hours at that dinner, Celso and Sombra then left in Sombra's car, an armored Mitsubishi Pajero. They were driving through the south zone of São Paulo when 3 cars started chasing their vehicle. The chase lasted about 3 kilometers. The criminals blocked the Pajero on Antonio Bezerra Street. 6 armed men got out and started shooting at the car. The armor held up well, but then the doors opened. And here's a detail that's going to be very important later on. In an armored car, you can't get in from the outside, at least not easily, if the driver or whoever is inside doesn't want the door opened. After all, an armored car is a kind of protective capsule. The doors then only open from the inside, and this actually caused a lot of controversy in the case. The criminals pulled Celso Daniel out of the passenger seat when they managed to open the doors, and Sombra was released right there at the scene unharmed. 2 days later, on Sunday morning, Celso Daniel's body was found by locals on a dirt road in Juquitiba, in the countryside of São Paulo. He had 8 bullet wounds on his body, burn marks on his back made with the barrel of a revolver, and abrasions on his mouth, arm, and thigh. His arms and legs were contracted, which the forensic team would later call cadaveric spasm. This is a sign that the victim suffered intensely before dying. The medical examiner, Carlos de Dumont de Printes, who was responsible for the autopsy, described the sequence. He said that first there was a blow to the head, probably at the moment of the kidnapping. Then hours of torture, burns, and gunshots fired at close range. So close that the bullet fragments became embedded in his skin. A shot to the chest, to the shoulder. On the forearm in a defensive position, and finally, already on the ground, in a fetal position. 2 shots to the face and 2 to the back. Prince, with 21 years of experience and over 20,000 autopsies, said a phrase that left a lasting impression. The occurrence of death in cases of express kidnapping is exceptional. I have never examined a case where there was a ritual of torture with the cruelty and disproportionality that I found on Celso Daniel's body.
I'm on the Regis Bittencourt Highway. We're following the police on the way to the city of Juquitiba. There is information that a body matching the mayor's description has been found. We've arrived at the location. A lot of police, onlookers. On the dirt road surrounded by the forest lies the body, executed with several gunshots, at least 7. On the back, on the chest, on the nape.
The police investigation was concluded in just 2 months. The conclusion, ordinary crime. The criminals, members of a gang from a community called Pantanal in the south zone of São Paulo, supposedly kidnapped Celso Daniel by chance after losing their original target. 6 were arrested and convicted. Case closed, right? Not really. From then on, several people connected to the case started dying in circumstances that were considered suspicious. In total, there were about 7 suspicious deaths. Dionisio Severo was a criminal specialized in kidnappings with a long record with the São Paulo police. The public prosecutor's office identified him as a key figure in the operation that resulted in the death of Celso Daniel. According to investigators, this Dionisio was the link between the gang that carried out the kidnapping and those who ordered the kidnapping. Here's a detail. 2 days before the crime, Dionisio escaped from Ili prison. by helicopter in a cinematic operation where accomplices pointed a gun at the pilot's head and forced him to land inside the prison yard. When he was recaptured months later in Alagoas, he promised the investigators that he would tell them everything he knew about who ordered the kidnapping of the mayor. Before he could keep his promise, however, he was murdered with dozens of stab wounds inside the prison.
Investigators said newspaper headlines focused on the cinematic escape since everything went as planned. They got away, and I'm still alive here because it seems the guys I helped escape had 8 murders to their name. But I didn't care. Imagine that. Celso Daniel died here, there was a rescue over there, so an escape I had pulled off was a completely different story. Later, through the media, I found out that there was this connection.
And on the phone that this Dionisio was using in prison, they discovered frequent calls to a police officer from the narcotics division named Otavio Mercier. Otavio was questioned by Internal Affairs. He said he didn't know anything. Shortly after, he was shot dead inside his house. Sergio Aurelia, who hid Dionisio after the escape, was found burned in the trunk of a car. Ira Moraes Redua, the first funeral director to arrive there in Juquitiba, was shot twice while putting groceries in the trunk of his car. As for Antonio Palacio de Oliveira, the waiter who served Celso Daniel and Sombra at Rubaya that day, he was actually the pair's regular waiter there, and they sometimes sat at that table with friends. He was chased by 2 men on a motorcycle, assaulted, lost control, and crashed into a pole. The police recorded it as a robbery, but nothing was taken from him. And here's the thing, Antonio had fake documents and a deposit of 60,000 reais in his account. The origin was never identified. Paulo Henrique Brito, the only witness who claimed to have witnessed the waiter's death, was murdered in the same place 20 days later with a shot in the back. The coroner himself, Carlos del Monte Printes, died shortly after. He had given an interview to Joe Suarez and said that he had been forbidden to speak publicly about the case and demoted from his position for maintaining that what happened involved torture. He died sometime after that interview. Suspicious deaths. All of them were people who knew or saw something about the Celso Daniel case, but nothing was ever confirmed, okay? There was always an official explanation that kept everything from being linked to the case. You didn't see I was recording because the chair was in front, but these books just fell out of nowhere. I was talking about suspicious deaths. It freaked me out.
The mayor of Santo André, who at the time took part in drafting the government program for the future President Lula, was tortured and killed. After him, 7 other people connected to the case were murdered or died under mysterious circumstances.
You must be wondering about Sombra, right? After all, he was released at the time of the kidnapping. Well, the forensic investigation revealed details that didn't match his version, okay? He said that the tire went flat during the chase and the car had an electrical failure. The forensic investigation found the tire was punctured after the car had stopped and the vehicle was still functioning normally despite the gunshots.
Regarding his claims, where he said the car had a problem with the transmission, we examined the transmission to see if there was an issue. No problem was found. The car works fine. The transmission is normal.
I mean, what was said doesn't really match what you are seeing here.
Yeah, the version he gave doesn't match what's being found here in the car, right?
And the question is, in an armored car that's still working, why would you stop and why would you open the locked doors? Sombra changed his story apparently several times.
The guy from the big network is exposing me, man. He's saying that everything I said is a lie, that the car is working, that the door won't unlock, that I'm the main suspect. Man.
We have to set something up. Why? Because the ticket companies, together with Mitsubishi, for obvious market reasons, joined forces. To say that this is a lie because the gearbox is working, the inspection showed that the gearbox is working.
Celso Daniel's family never accepted the version of it being a common crime, okay? His brother, João Francisco Daniel, stated that Celso had a dossier with evidence of illicit enrichment by Sombra and other members involved in the corruption scheme at the Santo André City Hall. According to the public prosecutor's office, Santo André was one of the main hubs for illegal fundraising, thus supporting the party's campaigns. In 2005, the case was reopened and assigned to Detective Elizabeth Sá. She reportedly produced a report of about 5 pages and did not carry out basic procedures, such as, for example, the wiretapping of those involved, and maintained the previous conclusion of it being a common crime. A detail that the family publicly questioned was that Elizabeth Sa was the aunt of the husband of Lula's daughter, linking the crime to the bribery scheme operating in the city hall. Sombra was even indicted to go to a jury trial, but he never made it to the defendant's bench because he died of cancer in 2016, 3 months before the first hearing. Sombra was convicted in another case 15 years ago for leading a bribery scheme involving transportation companies hired by the city hall. The judge stated that the bribery scheme was known within the Workers' Party, but this statement was considered controversial because it was treated as the judge's interpretation, not as a fact that was tried and definitive, therefore.
The businessman Sergio Gomez da Silva, known as Sombra, accused of being connected to the murder of the mayor of Santo André, Celso Daniel, from the Workers' Party, has died here in São Paulo. The crime happened in 2002.
Last year, Sombra was sentenced to 15 years in prison for corruption and was appealing the decision while free.
Celso Daniel was kidnapped, tortured for hours, and executed with 8 gunshots. The official version says it was a common crime, unplanned, committed by a gang that targeted the wrong person. 7 witnesses died afterward, under suspicious circumstances. The man who was having dinner with Celso on the night of the kidnapping was released without a scratch, changed his story several times, was accused of being the mastermind, and died before the trial. And the dossier that Celso supposedly kept about the corruption scheme in Santo André was never found by the police. But documents were removed from his apartment before the investigators arrived. To this day, the mastermind behind Celso Daniel's murder has not been definitively tried. Despite the official version, there are still strong suspicions of a political crime. Maybe a witness silencing hit. It could even be what the official version says. But for an ordinary crime, the consequences, circumstances, coincidences, and chances were very unusual, and all that remains about the case to this day is a huge shadow.
Raul Fernandez from Amaral Street, Dock Street, and Angela Diniz, the Panther of Minas, had it all. They were rich, beautiful, and famous. But on the eve of New Year's Eve in 1976, the silence of the sophisticated Buzios Resort in Rio de Janeiro was shattered by 4 gunshots.
Angela Maria Fernandez Diniz was from Curvelo, Minas Gerais, and was raised in Belo Horizonte. Daughter of a dentist and a seamstress who was a housewife, her mother began to see her daughter's beauty as a way to achieve social ascent through a good marriage. In that context of the 1960s, a good marriage meant marrying a rich, influential man who could offer financial stability and social status. And that's exactly what happened. At 17 years old, Angela walked down the aisle to marry the engineer, Milton Vilas Boas, who was 31, a member of a traditional family from Minas Gerais, surrounded by money, prestige, and political influence. In fact, with relatives connected to the Supreme Federal Court. However, after 9 years of marriage and the birth of 3 children, the union came to an end. It is said that, in exchange for a generous alimony, Angela agreed to leave the custody of the children with her husband. So, at 26 years old, she began a new phase in her life. After the separation, she started living between Rio, São Paulo, and Rio's wealthy circles, surrounded by artists and businessmen, playboys, and society columnists. Very beautiful, young, charismatic, and connected to the high society of Minas Gerais and Rio, her life seemed like an endless succession of parties, trips, and relationships. The socialite, who even voluntarily checked herself into a rehabilitation clinic, became one of the most photographed women of her time. Her face appeared on the covers of newspapers and magazines, although not always in the society columns.
From then on, Angela started appearing more and more in the society columns.
Angela Diniz became known as the Panther of Minas.
She was for a long time the most striking person in Minas society at the time, right?
Angela Diniz ended up involved in several criminal cases. One of them was related to drug possession, another to the alleged kidnapping of her own daughter, and the most serious to the homicide of José Avelino dos Santos, 17 years old, known as Zé Pretinho. The young man worked as a caretaker and guard at Angela's residence there in Belo Horizonte. His body was found outside the house in June 1973, lifeless, with gunshot wounds to the face. The scene caught the authorities' attention because the young man had a knife in his hand. His fly was open and there were signs of ejaculation. This initially supported the hypothesis of an attempted sexual assault. At first, Angela took responsibility for the shooting, claiming self-defense.
At the police station, Angela admits to killing the caretaker. The reason?
Armed with a knife, he allegedly tried to break into the room to assault her.
However, investigations indicated the presence of a third person in the residence that night. The millionaire from Minas Gerais, Arthur Valle Mendez, known as Tuca Mendez, heir to the Mendez Mesquita Group. Since Tuca was married, it is believed that Angela tried to protect him by taking the blame for the crime. Later, however, the businessman claimed that he saw a shadow outside the house that night, went to check, was attacked, and responded by shooting. The case caused a huge scandal in high society. Even so, everything ended rather mildly. Although it went to trial, the self-defense argument initially prevailed, and Tuca never actually served time in a closed regime, which reinforced the image of the untouchability of the elite at that time. In a new chapter of her life, Angela Diniz then met her future killer in August 1976. During a dinner with the São Paulo elite, an intense and turbulent relationship began that led Raul Fernando do Amaral Street, known as Doca Street, to leave his wife and children to live with Angela in Búzios on the coast of Rio. Who was Doca Street? He was born into a traditional family with a silver spoon in his mouth. Doca was the grandson of industrialist Jorge Street. Despite his privileged background, trips abroad, and good looks, he never built wealth or a solid career through his own efforts. He drifted between temporary jobs and was financially dependent on the women he was involved with. The relationship between Angela and Doca was very intense, okay? Even obsessive and deeply turbulent, marked by fits of jealousy, violent arguments, and constant reconciliations. Supposedly, alcohol and drugs were frequent elements there, present in that destructive relationship which lasted only 4 months. The foreshadowing of the tragedy began hours before the murder, on that same December 30, 1976, at Angela Diniz's beach house, located at Praia dos Ossos in Búzios. The details emerged later during the trial. According to the version presented by Doc Street's defense, a young German tourist named Gabriele Dyer, who had interacted with Angela on the beach, ended up becoming the trigger for the couple's final argument. The lawyer's narrative claims that Angela had shown interest in the German woman and suggested a sexual relationship involving the three of them, herself, Gabriele, and Doca. Still, according to the defense, this would have triggered in Doca a deep crisis of jealousy, humiliation, and loss of emotional control, serving as the spark for the argument that would end in tragedy. Hours after that, Angela supposedly announced the end of the relationship and kicked Doca out of the house. He left, but returned a short time later, trying to reconcile. According to the murderer's own testimony, Angela supposedly set conditions for the relationship to continue. Absolute freedom to come and go, without needing to ask for permission or give explanations to her partner. In addition, Doca stated that she demanded he accept any other romantic partners she might have, whether men or women. At a certain moment, Doca grabbed a pistol and fired 4 shots at Angela Diniz, 3 to her face and the back of her neck. Angela died right there at the age of 32. After the murder, Doca Street fled to Minas Gerais, where he stayed for a few days while his defense team tried to start organizing his legal defense. When he finally decided to turn himself into the police, his lawyers were already working on the strategy that would be used in court, turning the homicide into an alleged crime of passion, arguing that Doca had acted under the influence of strong emotion and was completely consumed by jealousy. The first trial took place on October 18, 1979 in the city of Cabo Frio in Rio. The defense was handled by the renowned criminal lawyer Evandro Lince Silva, considered one of the most influential lawyers in the country at that time. The strategy adopted would go down in Brazilian legal history. Instead of focusing the defense exclusively on the murder, the lawyers began to directly attack Angela Diniz's reputation. During the trial, she was portrayed as promiscuous, libertine, manipulative, and provocative. The main argument of the defense was that Doca had acted in legitimate defense of his honor. In practice, the thesis maintained that Angela's moral conduct and love life had caused the defendant such intense emotional humiliation that he completely lost control. The trial quickly turned into a media spectacle. Outside the courthouse, there were onlookers, journalists, and supporters of Doca Street. At times, the killer was even applauded, while Angela, already dead, was morally condemned in the eyes of the public. The outcome shocked much of the country. Doca Street was sentenced to only 2 years in prison. Even so, he received a suspended sentence and left the courthouse free without going to jail.
Doka Street was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but since he already received a suspended sentence, he will serve his sentence while free. As soon as the judge read the sentence, which Doka heard, visibly moved, the commotion began. Everyone wanted to talk to Doka Street.
The decision caused enormous outrage, especially among feminist movements, who began to organize historic demonstrations with the slogan, "Those who love do not kill." The handling of the trial was so absurd that the newspaper O Pasquem mocked the defense's strategy, stating that the lawyers seemed determined to prove that Angela killed Doka. The enormous social pressure and the strong feminist movement led the court to annul the first trial. In November 1981, Doka Street returned for a jury trial, but by that time, Brazil was already a different country. The feminist movement was much more organized and public opinion had changed profoundly. This time, the argument of defense of honor lost its strength and Doka Street was sentenced to 15 years in prison for homicide. Even so, he did not serve the full sentence in a closed prison regime. He spent about 4 years in a closed regime, then was transferred to a semi-open regime. In 1987, he was granted parole. And I need to say that some sources differ, okay, on the actual amount of time he spent in prison. After leaving prison, he lived quietly in São Paulo. In 2006, he published the book Mea Culpa, in which he presented his own version of the crime. Doka Street died on December 18, 2020 at the age of 86 after suffering a heart attack.
From this thesis, Doka Street, known for killing the socialite Angela Diniz, died today after a heart attack. Raul Fernando do Amaral Street was 86 years old. He murdered Angela Diniz with 4 shots because he couldn't accept the end of their relationship.
And the case of Angela Diniz became a historic milestone in Brazil because it helped to nationally expose the legal and cultural mechanism known as the legitimate defense of honor, which was used for decades to justify the murders of women committed by jealous partners. Finally, 47 years after the crime, in 2023, the Supreme Federal Court officially declared the use of the legitimate defense of honor thesis unconstitutional in Brazilian courts. On that occasion, the Angela Diniz case was mentioned as one of the most emblematic historical examples of this type of legal argument.
Two friends were found dead at the top of a hill in Niterói. Next to the bodies, already in a state of decomposition, the police found 2 mysterious lead masks.
The case, which would become known throughout Brazil as the mystery of the lead masks, began in a quiet and disturbing way, until on August 20, 1966, in an isolated region of Muro do Vintém near the city of Niterói in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Decades later, it would continue to be remembered as one of the most enigmatic episodes in Brazilian police history, surrounded by theories about spiritual experiences, extraterrestrial contacts, and secret rituals. That afternoon, August 20, a young man named Jorge da Costa Alves, only 18 years old, climbed Muro do Vintém, apparently to fly a kite, as he had done so many other times. The place was remote, covered by vegetation, and known for its privileged view of the region. As he walked, he noticed something strange there in the bushes. He approached cautiously and saw 2 dead men lying side by side on the ground. The young man was startled. The bodies were already decomposing, indicating that the deaths had occurred days earlier. The scene was too strange to look like a simple accident. Since this story is 60 years old, the details of the numerous accounts obviously vary. The 2 men were wearing suits. As for the so-called waterproof coats or raincoats, it's not known whether they were wearing them or if they were near the bodies. It is mentioned that there were 2 towels left inside a package, and also a handkerchief with an embroidered monogram, but it didn't match their names or anyone else who was later investigated. But over their eyes they had masks made of lead shaped like glasses without lenses. This very unusual detail would turn the case into one of the greatest mysteries in the country. It is reported that the police were called, but they took a long time to take the report about the bodies seriously. It was raining heavily and the place was hard to reach, requiring almost a 2-hour walk through the woods uphill. But in the end, the police showed up at the scene and secured the area. The civil police investigators initially noticed that there were no apparent signs of violence. There were no signs of a struggle, blood, injuries, or any clear indication of murder. There were also no signs of robbery since the men's belongings were still with them. There was mention of a gold wedding band, a watch, and documents. The men were identified as Manuel Pereira da Cruz, 32 years old, and Miguel Jose Viana, 34 years old. Both were electronics technicians and residents of Campos dos Goitacazes in the interior of Rio de Janeiro. They worked with radio and television equipment, a profession that would later fuel countless theories involving scientific experiments and supposed attempts to contact other worlds. Is that really the case? Near the bodies, the police found some seemingly ordinary objects, but they ended up becoming key pieces of the puzzle. There was an empty water bottle, a package containing 2 towels, and in the pocket of one of the men a small notepad. On it were written numbers and symbols that, according to experts, were technical references used in vacuum tubes. But it was another piece of paper found with Miguel Jose Viana that turned the case into a true national enigma. The note, handwritten, said the following: 4:30 p.m., be at the designated place. 6:30 p.m., ingest Camas after effect, protect metals, wait for signal, mask. The messages seemed like a kind of instruction for carefully planned activities, didn't they? The content, of course, raised numerous questions. What kind of capsule was that? What signal were they waiting for? And why did they need to protect their eyes using lead masks? The investigation then went back a few days in time to reconstruct the last steps of this pair. And it was discovered that Manuel and Miguel had left Campos dos Goitacazes on August 17th. They told their families that they were going on a trip to buy electronic materials in Niterói. The bus tickets found with them confirmed the date of the trip. Other versions, however, or other witnesses knew that the trip would be to São Paulo with the purpose of buying a car. Witnesses reported that after the men arrived in the city, they bought raincoats at a local store. Reenactments showed it was raining, but they weren't wearing raincoats. Do you remember I mentioned this earlier? They mentioned raincoats, but it's unclear if they wore or just carried them. Also, according to reports, one of them seemed constantly nervous when he was seen there, right? Looking around as if he was waiting for someone or something. They also bought a bottle of water, and the glass container was supposed to be returned later. After that, the trail of the two disappeared, and a few days later, their bodies would be found up on the hill. The bodies were sent to the medical examiner's office, but the advanced state of decomposition made the examinations very difficult. The experts did not find any signs of physical violence, nor assault, nor puncture wounds, but they were unable to perform toxicological tests, at least not effective ones, to detect any kind of poison or drug.
So what did we do? As is usually done in an autopsy, we took samples from the brain and lung, liver, kidney, and the entire stomach with its contents and part of the intestine. And what was also surprising was that the toxicology test came back negative.
Forensic experts working today mention a certain technical limitation of that time, as well as professional negligence in the thorough investigation of the case. For example, no soil samples were collected, even though there was a strange absence of vegetation that persisted for years, which led to the idea of radioactive contamination or something similar. Radioactive contamination and a lead mask are somewhat related, right? After about 2 months of analysis, the official report on the case brought a frustrating answer: cause of death undetermined. Obviously, the lack of answers fueled the public imagination. They talked about poisoning, packs, a UFO event. Actually, everything there is undetermined, right? While the police were trying to find concrete answers, increasingly strange reports started to appear. In fact, that night, it was reported that countless local residents claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky, which were, of course, attributed to unidentified flying objects. And only later were they connected to the men's deaths.
Honestly, I don't believe that beings from another planet or extraterrestrial beings were responsible for the death or deaths or have any connection to the deaths of Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz. I think it was people from right here on Earth.
2 points are important in the investigation, okay? The involvement of at least a third man who would have guided the victims to the location through the woods, and the 2-hour gap between the planned actions. 4:30 and 6:30. The magazine O Cruzeiro, which was famous at the time, revealed that Manuel and Miguel were friends with a man named Elcio Correa Gomes. The three of them formed a group there that carried out experiments considered to be scientific and spiritual, involving homemade explosives, supernatural phenomena, and possible contacts with unknown forces from beyond.
Elcio was arrested and harshly interrogated by the Niterói police. but nothing was proven against him. Not even Miguel's brother, Erval Viana, believes today that Elcio had anything to do with the death of the two friends.
Despite that, Elcio was not in Niterói at the time of his friends' deaths. Even so, his statement to the police would become one of the most disturbing parts of the investigation. According to records published by the newspaper Correio da Manhã, Elcio stated that Manuel and Miguel used to go to isolated places where they performed mystical rituals under the influence of psychoactive chemical substances. In this context, the pair believed in expanding the mind and the possibility of contacting supernatural entities. The statements reinforce the theory that the two technicians were involved in some kind of esoteric or spiritualist group. In the victims' homes, investigators found books and publications about spiritism, mental energy, esotericism, and paranormal phenomena. And what I can mention in light of all this is the similarity to Santo Daime practices with the use of ayahuasca. Current sources even mention similarities with Scientology. Shortly after, the police chief in charge of the case, Idavan Ferreira, told the press that he believed it was a failed parapsychological experiment. In his view, the technicians might have ingested drugs or unknown substances during a ritual, dying accidentally, but that explanation didn't convince everyone, okay? Soon, much more extraordinary theories began to emerge. One of the most famous involved unidentified flying objects. In this case, the lead mass would serve to protect the eyes against an extremely strong light. Some believed the object emitted it and that the technicians were trying to pick up signals from other planets using their knowledge of electronics and spiritualist experiments at the same time. Although it makes sense, given the absolute lack of evidence, this theory leaves very important points about the presence and participation of others unanswered.
Having found no other suspects, the police accepted the hypothesis of closing the case without solving the main mystery of Morro do Vintém, how Miguel and Manuel died. The only thing certain was that something very strange had happened here.
And about the disappearance of the money, well, back in 1966, they had $1,000 in their hands. That was a lot of money, guys, back then. It's estimated to be the equivalent of a middle-class worker's annual salary. The amount was supposedly for buying a car. Remember I mentioned that? Anyway, 3 years later, with no solution, the investigation was officially closed while still in the investigation phase. They say there were suspicions regarding the Spiritist Study Center, the so-called 1966 version of Scientology. Well, the place was close to Morro do Vintém and frequented by powerful people. That might have been the reason why they called off the investigations.
There are many questions and few answers. Miguel and Manuel left Campos saying they were going to São Paulo. They went up the hill alone or with someone. Who could have gone with the two of them? Why did they go up there? Why were they wearing lead masks? What were they protecting themselves from? Where did the victims' money go?
Over the decades, the case became the subject of books, documentaries, television shows, and debates about ufology, occultism, and paranormal phenomena. To this day, many people believe that Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana died during a scientific experiment that got out of control. Others argue that they were victims of some financial scam or mind manipulation involving toxic substances. There are still those who remain convinced that the pair were really waiting there for contact with something from another world. Remember that the masks were made by the men themselves in the workshop where they worked. But regardless of the theory you choose, one thing has remained the same since 1966. No one has been able to explain anything for sure about what happened. And that includes experts literally from all over the world, okay, who came to Brazil in search of answers, in search of proof for their own theories. People from different fields of knowledge who went back home empty-handed. Over these decades, many people have already passed away. Reporters, investigators, coroners, relatives, friends, witnesses, and the case file itself or part of it disappeared. To know exactly what happened there, I believe only the two who died know. If anyone else knew, they kept it a secret.
Who is this woman? Since Stuart Angel disappeared in the dictatorship's dungeons, Zuzu has fought tirelessly just to be able to bury him. A fight she lost as tragically as she lost her own son.
A woman without limits. The story of Zuleika, or Zuzu Angel Jones, began long before her death in 1976. Zuzu was from Minas Gerais, passionate about sewing since she was a girl, and she became one of the most well-known fashion designers in Brazil in the 60s and 70s after divorcing her American husband. The fashion she created drew attention for its use of Brazilian references like embroidery, lace, birds, flowers, and elements inspired by Northeastern culture. The designer won over famous clients both inside and outside Brazil, including Hollywood actresses and also members of high society. But Zuzu's life underwent a radical transformation because of the disappearance of her son, Stuart Angel Jones. Stuart was a university student and was active in MR8, an armed opposition group against the military government at the time. MR8, to finance its struggle and objective, which was the implementation of socialism in the country, carried out robberies, bank expropriations, thefts of weapons, urban guerrilla actions, and political kidnappings, including that of the American ambassador Charles Burke Elbrick.
The American ambassador in Brazil, Charles Elbrick, was leaving his house in a car with a driver. When they turned onto this street, traffic was blocked by a beetle that seemed to be maneuvering. In fact, it was the beginning of a kidnapping that exposed the Brazilian military dictatorship internationally.
That's how Stuart and his friends came under the military's watch until his arrest on May 14, 1971. Detained by agents linked to the Air Force Information Center in Rio de Janeiro, he disappeared that day and his body was never recovered. 2 years later, his wife and companion in the political trenches, Sonia Angel, was also arrested, tortured, and killed by agents of the military regime. In the months following her son's disappearance, Zuzu began a desperate search for information about his whereabouts. His real whereabouts, since she believed he was alive and that she could get answers through official channels. This was taking into account her international reputation and her son's dual citizenship. Thus, she, in a fearless and determined manner, sought answers from authorities, lawyers, military personnel, and politicians. As time went by, reports began to emerge from political prisoners saying that Stuart had been tortured and killed inside military facilities. One of these reports came from Alex Polari, who sent Zuzu a letter revealing that Stuart, inside the Galeão Air Base, had been dragged while tied to a jeep. With his mouth close to the exhaust pipe, the young man was forced to breathe smoke and engine fumes while being dragged. The body was never returned to the family, and there are 3 hypotheses regarding his remains. The body was allegedly taken by helicopter to the Restinga de Marambaia area in Rio de Janeiro and thrown into the sea. He was allegedly buried as a pauper under a false name in a suburban cemetery in Rio, possibly in Inhaúma. Or the body may have been secretly buried in a military area connected to the Santa Cruz Air Base. But after learning of her son's death, Zuzu began to use her international notoriety to denounce the case. Described as a woman without limits, she wrote letters, gave interviews, sought out foreign journalists, and tried to mobilize international authorities, all in search of justice. Since Stuart had both Brazilian and American citizenship, she also sought support from the United States. In one of her most well-known actions, she handed documents about the case to the then U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who was visiting Brazil.
Baby, what do you want?
This is a file about the death of my son, which occurred inside the Brazilian government's official building. His father is an American citizen. Please help me.
I know that Senator Ted Kennedy also mentioned Stuart's disappearance in the United States Senate. At the same time, Zuzu incorporated her personal drama into her work as a fashion designer. Her fashion shows began to feature dark symbols, gagged angels, red stains resembling blood, birds trapped in cages, tanks, and imprisoned children. A fashion show held in New York became known as a kind of artistic protest against political repression in Brazil. As the years went by, many people started to distance themselves from Zuzu, who, obsessed with her son's death, was engaged in an admirable yet dangerous crusade. She was aware of this. She said she was constantly followed and threatened, so much so that shortly before she died, she left letters with people close to her stating that if she were to have an accident, the ones responsible would be the same men involved in Stuart's disappearance.
If something happens to me, if I turn up dead from an accident, robbery, or any other cause, it will have been the work of the same murderers who killed my beloved son.
Then, in the early hours of April 14, 1976, after Zuzu left a meeting at a friend's house in Leblon, in the south zone of Rio, She met her death on Estrada da Gavea, near the exit of the Dois Irmãos tunnel, heading toward Barra da Tijuca, where she lived. It was around 2:14 or 2:15 in the early morning when she lost control of the car, hit the protective barrier of the overpass, and plunged down to a lane below. The vehicle was completely destroyed and Zuzu died trapped in the wreckage. The official version mentions sleepiness, sudden illness, drunkenness, or mechanical failure.
Zuzu Angel's relatives were certain that she had been murdered, and their belief was supported by the police. The police investigation then reported the fashion designer died in an accident, suggesting Zuzu either fell asleep at the wheel, was drunk, or had a sudden illness. A controversial conclusion.
Only 2 decades later, in 1998, the Special Commission on Political Deaths and Disappearances recognized that Zuzu Angel's death occurred in the context of political persecution and pointed to strong evidence of an attack.
The witness says the fashion designer's death wasn't accidental. Zuzu Angel's car was allegedly cut off by another car that was following her.
Zuzu's body was buried at São João Batista Cemetery in Rio de Janeiro. Her son Stuart's remains were never officially found. 2 masterpieces by Chico Buarque immortalized Zuzu Angel's pain, mourning, and struggle: Angelica and Pedaço de Mim.
Tim Lopes's death is neither greater nor lesser than that of an ordinary citizen, but it is symbolic because it represents an attempt to silence the press, which is the voice and the eyes of society.
When the country was still trying to understand the sequence of events related to the death of the mayor of Santo André, Celso Daniel, society was confronted once again with another shocking crime, which took place on June 2, 2002 in Rio de Janeiro, a crime that changed the history of Brazilian journalism. That's right, we're going to talk about the disappearance and death of Arcanjo Antonio Lopes do Nascimento, known as Tim Lopes.
The 2 drug dealers are part of Elias Maluco's gang and have provided the key testimony so far.
They confirmed to the police that Elias Maluco, Ratinho, Andre Capeta, and Boy tortured and murdered Tim Lopes.
Tim Lopes was born in Rio Grande do Sul, was 51 years old, and had been working as a journalist for about 30 years. He was highly respected by his fellow journalists as one of the most courageous and daring investigative reporters active at the time. Tim Lopes was seen by his colleagues as an old-school journalist who built his reports by walking the streets, talking to people, and closely observing the reality he intended to show. While many professionals were already starting to rely more and more on information obtained from a distance, he preferred to be at the center of events, listening to stories directly from the people and often living undercover in the environment he was going to write about. And it was precisely his boldness in exposing crimes that made him vulnerable to ruthless criminal actions.
Yesterday afternoon, a police team found a charred body at the top of the hill, which was taken for analysis at the Carlos Zabeli Institute. The results of the forensic examination should be released in a week. The organization Reporters Without Borders, based in Paris, expressed concern about the case today and called for clarification of the circumstances surrounding Tim Lopes' disappearance.
Tim Lopes disappeared on June 2, 2002 while working on a news report. A large part of his work was dedicated to revealing the harsh reality faced by the poorest residents of the communities in Rio de Janeiro. Citizens held hostage by the fear imposed by the power of drug trafficking, living on the margins without effective protection from the state. They say that during his investigation into the issue of child prostitution at funk parties, Tim had already entered the Vila Cruzeiro community several times. However, on June 2nd, he returned after being informed that a funk party would be held that night, an event where child prostitution would take place. In addition to drug dealing, of course. Dropped off by a Rede Globo driver near the community, Tim Lopes quietly entered a bar, bought a beer, and stayed there, sitting and watching what was going on while he secretly recorded armed drug dealers moving through the community who were riding motorcycles through the community. But 2 members of the gang, known by the nicknames Andre Capeta and Boizinho, noticed a light coming from the bag strapped to the journalist's waist, where the camera used for recording was hidden.
2 drug dealers became suspicious of the journalist's presence, supposedly because of a shining object. However, the micro camera equipment does not have any lights.
Shortly after, Tim was surrounded and interrogated. With no way to hide the truth, he revealed that he was a journalist from Globo. But since he usually worked undercover, he didn't carry documents that could prove his professional identity. The criminal's suspicion quickly turned into violence. Right there in the middle of the street, he was assaulted while the traffickers contacted the local drug lord by radio, Elias Pereira da Silva, known as Elias Maluco.
According to the testimony, the 4 traffickers did not identify the journalist as the author of the report. According to the testimony, Elias Maluco was responsible for the execution with sword blows. The journalist's body was reportedly burned.
Elias ordered him to be taken to the Grota Favela, there in the Complexo do Alemão. Even before they put Tim in the trunk of the stolen car, the traffickers shot him in the legs and tied his hands to prevent any reaction.
Still according to the testimony, the 2 traffickers approached and searched Tim Lopes. He was allegedly beaten, tied up, and shot in the foot to prevent him from escaping.
Thus began the journey that would take the reporter to the heart of the territory controlled by the criminal faction. When he arrived at the Grota Favela, considered the main stronghold of the criminal faction in the Alamo complex, Tim Lopes was taken directly to Elias Maluco. There, he was quickly recognized by the drug dealer Ratinho, who identified Tim Lopes as the one responsible for the series of reports. Drug Market aired on Jornal Nacional in 2001 and awarded the ESSO Prize, which had caused losses to the drug trade and led members of the gang to prison. Convinced of the journalist's identity, Ratinho demanded his execution. Tim was then tied to a tree while he desperately tried to convince the criminals to spare his life, but he was already condemned there. According to reports later obtained by the police, several drug dealers witnessed the reporter's trial and execution. It's worth noting that in 2002, the FIFA World Cup also took place, which was hosted by South Korea and Japan. So, on the day Tim Lopes disappeared, the TV stations were broadcasting 4 matches and there was anticipation for Brazil's debut the next day against Turkey. That, supposedly, was one of the reasons why Tim Lopes' absence was only noticed and reported 11 hours after he disappeared. Even though Rede Globo had been informed by the driver that Tim hadn't returned to the meeting point right, as had been agreed when he dropped him off at the foot of the hill. The case ended up in the hands of Inspector Daniel Gomes from the Rio de Janeiro Civil Police, who began investigating. In Vila Cruzeiro, where the residents were talking, frightened about a man who had been captured and beaten by traffickers the previous night. Initial reports suggested that the body had been burned in an isolated area of the favela. When they arrived at the indicated location, the police found signs of fire, fresh blood, and human remains. But later examinations showed that that material did not belong to Tim Lopes. Days later then, 2 drug dealers connected to Elias Maluco's gang were arrested and ended up revealing details of the crime. According to the statements, Tim had been taken to the grotto in the Complexo do Alemão, as I said. With this information, the police intensified the search until Tim Lopes' remains were found on June 12, 2002, 10 days after his disappearance, in a clandestine grave in the area known as Pedra do Sapo. At the site, fragments of burned bones and personal belongings of the journalist were discovered, such as a watch, a crucifix, and the small camera used in the investigation. A little over 3 weeks later, on July 5, 2002, DNA tests done on a rib fragment confirmed that part of those remains really belonged to Tim Lopes. According to the investigations, Tim Lopes was subjected to a brutal session of violence led by Elias and other members of the gang as well. The reports detailed that his eyes were burned, damaged with cigarettes, and he was dismembered alive, an act that shocked even the investigators who were already used to the extreme violence of Rio's drug trafficking. After killing him, the traffickers tried to eliminate any trace of the crime using a method known in the favelas at the time as microwave, in which the victim was placed between tires, covered with fuel, and set on fire. Throughout the investigation, 9 members of the gang were eventually identified. Among them were Elias Maluco, the leader of the group, as well as criminals known by the nicknames Andre Capeta, Ratinho, Boizinho, Husha, Zu, Primo, Cadê, and Frei. 2 of them, Andre Capeta and Boizinho, died before the trial, however. Boizinho died in a shootout with the police, and Andre Capeta under circumstances attributed to probable violence. Elias Maluco and the other surviving accomplices were sentenced to long prison terms. Elias received the longest sentence, exceeding 28 years in prison. Other members of the gang were also sentenced to more than 2 decades in prison, while one of the traffickers received a lighter sentence. Elias Maluco died on September 22, 2020 at the age of 54. He was found dead in his cell at the Catanduvas Federal Penitentiary in Paraná. Investigations showed he hanged himself. The brutality of the case had a strong national and international impact and helped to drive the creation of ABRAJE, which is the Brazilian Association of Investigative Journalism, founded in December 2002. Posthumously, Tim Lopes was honored with awards such as the National Human Rights Award and the Vladimir Herzog Award, and his name is given to public spaces in Rio de Janeiro.
Tim, you know that on sad days like today, we usually avoid saying goodnight, letting the silence of the studios show the full eloquence of our pain. Today we chose a different approach.
And this one was even more special, with 5 extremely remarkable cases from Brazilian criminal history. Did you like it? Please like, comment, even an emoji, or join as a member if possible. It really helps me. And hey, leave a comment here with cases for us to make a new episode, like listing the 5 most mysterious, most enigmatic cases, or those that really stood out because of injustice. Leave a comment so we can create our next episode together. Thanks for your attention, a kiss from the redhead, and see you next time.